I'm not sure how much my voice will hold up. I was prepared last night when I went to sleep to come here dapper with a tie and a suit jacket, but the universe had other plans for me. I woke up at 3 o'clock this morning, fatigued, and progressively got worse from there, and am just now coming from Minute Clinic with some type of asthma attack or asthma complication. And I wanted to wear this dapper suit really in memory of two people in my community who have passed. In the Black queer community, we've unfortunately been in a place of grief for the last 2 months. Jackie Anderson of Chicago, Butch Dyke, scholar activist, died on January 7th. And that's where my understanding of the city began. That's where my model of being a scholar activist comes from. And so I have to tell you something she told me, which was, tell the truth, okay? So some people may not like how I tell the truth or the body in which I tell this truth, but this is why I'm here. I also want to give respect to Devon Tyrone Wade, who passed around Thanksgiving in a very tragic death. He was a colleague of mine, a very bright young star, a doctoral candidate in Columbia Sociology, who, despite having 2 incarcerated parents, not only thrived and survived, but he excelled. He excelled, okay? And unfortunately, his life is now snuffed out. And so I'm walking in their footsteps right now because they can't be here. In Chicago, I learned the importance of the neighborhood. I learned that if you want to know where people are and how people have lived their life and what they're experiencing, you need to know where they come from, where they spend their time. When people were asking about the causal impact of neighborhoods in 2005, I went to a conference where Michelle Obama was the keynote speaker at the University of Chicago. People were asking, what was the causal impact of neighborhood mobility interventions like the Control Project, moving to opportunity? I asked, why were they there in the first place? Why weren't people concerned about bringing equity to the neighborhoods that they were in? This perspective, what I call the political economy perspective, that came from these types of conversations, these types of questions, and the research design that it begets is what prepared me for the Black Lives Matter movement. For some of us, hashtag I can't breathe is not merely a protest cry. I woke up this morning with difficulties breathing. I dismissed the symptoms of asthma so long until I was arrested to the bed in my hotel room after trying to dress myself. In Chicago, I found with my dissertation research that living in neighborhoods where minorities were more likely to get loans from mortgage lenders that were less regulated by the federal government was linked to a 27% increase in the odds of being diagnosed with asthma for children, not adults, children who did not choose to live in these neighborhoods. In New York City, where I have done the vast majority of the policing work that I'll talk about today, I have found similar links to illness tied to the actions and inactions of institutional gatekeepers. I'll have to tell a personal story before I give you all the cool data. It's a story that people ask, why do you think this way? Why do you look for the interlinks of institutional gatekeepers? Why don't you just focus on segregation or the manifestations of segregation, the inequalities in the schools, the inequalities in the criminal justice system, the inequalities in the housing? And I say all of that is well and done, but we have to know, how did they get there? I grew up in a place called, what I call the dump. It was less than 1 mile in Atlanta, Georgia, the metro area, from a solid waste site. My dad bought the property in about 1981. It was cheap to live out there, and he wasn't thinking about the environmental consequences of buying a home and raising a family in that area. Before the Great Recession, this area, 30294, we call it Ellenwood or South Decatur, had the highest foreclosure rate in metro Atlanta. It was on par with the city of Detroit. The residents there, 99.9% Black. High levels of home ownership. Working. There was very little public transportation. Everybody had a car. This was what people saw and think about as the Black Mecca. Okay? This was the promised land. When I was a child, I was admitted to the hospital in the ER for asthma complications, and eventually they put me on a series of steroids and other types of treatments and told me, go on, be well. But it was not until I was 30 years old, when I was in my first year as a postdoc at the University of Pennsylvania, and I was having, again, troubles breathing, that a doctor told me about the holistic impact of asthma on the body. It's not just about difficulties breathing. Asthma makes muscles that are little used or tend to be dormant overexert themselves. It accelerates the impact of infections, turning flus and colds into pneumonia and bronchitis. It makes people essentially be living sick. So that is my story about why I don't look at the immediate proximate causes of illness. I don't even look at necessarily the features of the neighborhood, the social, psychological, cultural features of the neighborhood that people have held up as the reason why Black folks, Latino folks, indigenous peoples are under siege with regards to their health. I look to the political economy. I look to the actions and the inactions of institutional gatekeepers like mortgage lenders, like police. I look to people who have control, power to determine who gets in where and what they pay to live there. Okay? The idea of policing in health really comes from our understanding of, in public health, thinking about police as first responders. And it has moved over time to thinking about policing itself, or the experience of interacting with a police as a type of stressor, or an acute stressor. Within the last 10 years or so, we've talked about the idea of police brutality, police violence. And we have moved, as scientists, the government, to hold police accountable for the loss of life that they engender. Police killings are public health data. So when we think about this, from thinking of understanding policing, we've primarily been focused on understanding mass incarceration. What's it like to be personally incarcerated? What's your health like? What's it like to have a family member or a parent who's been incarcerated? Even studying in Detroit, identifying relationships between neighborhood incarceration rates and asthma. And we focus on sometimes the most extreme aspect of this issue with the Black Lives Matter movement. People who are killed by police. We find that, unlike what we would expect, that racial disparities and likelihood of being killed by the police actually increase the less severe or the less immediate of a threat that Blacks are to whites or police. And so we have this data set that's been created not from police, because the police are not going to give you their data, not systematically. They have not been able to do this. They have not done this. So what's happened is that people from the outside journalists, researchers like yourself have gone in and used outside resources, newspapers, and so on and so forth to find out and document the number of people who are dying what we call legal intervention deaths. And unfortunately, we know that these are even undercounts. Okay? These are undercounts. In New York City, 25 legal intervention deaths, so to speak. This was 2015. But what we don't talk about is the collateral damage of police bias. What happens when the neighborhoods that people live in, the places that people inhabit, are surveilled by police using proactive, aggressive, hotspot policing tactics? We don't think about the girl in the picture. We focus on those who die, but we don't think about the girl in the picture who's still alive. We don't follow her health. And that's what I'm here to do today. So the idea that I kind of come into this thing with is kind of place-based approaches to understanding illness risk from a systems of inequality. And it starts in what I think, when you think about the political economy, back to Thomas Levice's work, looking at Black political empowerment, showing a distinct effect of Black political empowerment independent of the negative effects of Black segregation, economic segregation. Thinking about the ways in which we embody inequality, how it gets underneath the skin, the ways in which institutional racism eats into the ways in which we interact with our doctors. Why is it that I could go 30 years and someone tells me that there are muscles in my body that are overworked? I just thought it was random. Maybe I need to go lift some more weights. Okay? And there are other ways that people have started to think about and conceptualize what I call these systems of inequality. Primarily one that I think is really important is thinking about discrimination itself as a precedent to neighborhood effects. This is Ana Diaz-Rue's work. And more recently, racism as a fundamental cause of health. And I've identified in my research with a graduate student of mine, Kevin Jefferson, this idea of surveillance stress. We have policing as an everyday stressor, we know that. But we also have the idea that when you have this occurring in a concentrated way that's segregated by where people are, according to these boundaries, and they're not necessarily fixed boundaries, but there is a sociality to neighborhoods. There are places you don't go. There are places that you feel uncomfortable where your people's not going to be, right? There are train tracks cutting you off from certain resources. There are school districts and police districts. They all create little microcosms of isolation. And so we have this idea from Carla Shedd, the climate of fear, ecological stress. And we have this thinking about, for me, is that these interactions that are occurring between police, who are an institutional gatekeeper of the criminal justice system, and citizens, they activate a type of psychopathology in observers, people who are not actually being stopped themselves. Brain activity increases. Trauma actually can form. We have the idea that there's increased levels of hypervigilance and negative coping, where people who are worried that they're going to get stopped today. And as a matter of fact, if you look at these data sets on Stop, Question, and Frisk, there are people in these data sets who've been stopped 100 times in a year. There are types of bodies that have been stopped, tall, dark bodies, male bodies, bigger frames that have been stopped at higher rates. So even if you are not the one doing something that's wrong, because you live in that social status, you are still susceptible to the negative impacts of that vigilance that comes with it. It can lead to, as James Jackson states, people engaging in negative coping behaviors, eating salty foods and sweet foods and smoking and other types of behavioral adaptations. These types of coping activates a weathering process and increases the allostatic load, the inflammation in the body. Mind you, remember, think about the woman, the girl. She was just sitting there watching. right? And what happens is, if you ask some people who live in some of these neighborhoods, they don't even think about it. It's not on their conscious memory. But if you were to talk to them, yes, they're concerned about it. But nobody's really documenting the ways in which the body reacts to these interactions. And of course, we have perceptions of injustice and discrimination, which have been shown to have negative health effects. One of the first studies I looked at showed that we have palpable impacts on health outcomes across the domains. 8% increase in the likelihood of poor fair health, 11% increase in diabetes. Why? Diabetes. It's so far down the chain of causality. Okay? 17% increase in high blood pressure, 14% increase in asthma episodes within the past year, 22% increase in the likelihood of being overweight or obese. We find that not only is there an increase in the risk and the likelihood if you live in an area where there's higher levels of frisking and use of force, for you to have clinical distress, but men in those areas have a 21% increase in the likelihood compared to women of having clinical, non-specific psychological distress, 13% increase in nervousness compared to women, 12% increase in feeling like every day is an effort, 18% increase in feeling like they're worthless compared to women. So we ask this question: is there an illness risk associated with living in communities with a concentration with legal intervention deaths? And I'll just end this, and it's going to make you sad. It made me sad. And I'm going to look at these relationships and how they vary by gender. I'm not going to go too much into this, but this is how the data looks. Just want to show you the cool stuff. What we find is that for all New Yorkers, we see increases in most illnesses, not all of them, everything pretty much except diabetes. Much of this can be accounted for by neighborhood characteristics, that basic level that New Yorkers in all, men and women, are feeling. But if you were to parcel out the data by gender and only look at women, you find that there's much higher levels of illness for women who live in areas where there's more than 2 legal intervention deaths within a 10-year period, okay? And this goes from anything from diabetes to high blood pressure, asthma episodes, obesity. Again, much of this main effect accounted for by neighborhood effects. And we actually see lower rates of illness for men who live in these areas. But when you compare, and I want you to focus real quick, when you compare the gender difference in the impact of of legal intervention deaths on illness, not only do you see that women, compared to men, have a 14% increase in the likelihood of poor fair health, a 52% increase in the likelihood of diabetes, a 32% increase in the likelihood of high blood pressure, 8% increase in the likelihood of asthma episodes, 46% increase in the likelihood of obesity. But when you account for neighborhood conditions, it does not explain the gender gap. Women who survive these areas where police are engaging in lethal activities against citizens, and again, these are very rare things. For this data set, this is coming from a vital statistic, EpiQuery. We have a total of 75 legal intervention deaths that are documented between 2003 and 2013. When you map those legal intervention deaths across the different neighborhoods of New York City, and then identify those neighborhoods where there's more than 2, a high density, we call it, you find this pattern that women are bearing essentially the burden, the physical health burden of police lethality. I'll end there, and I'll say that I'm moving my research from thinking about the collateral consequences of surveillance stress, which is police, proactive policing strategies and so on and so forth, broken glass windows and stuff like that, thinking about police as agents of community trauma, to thinking about this concept of carceral grief. There's a grief that sits in our communities when people are taken from us. And it's not just the most extreme case, but when they're literally taken out of the home. There's a grief, there's a loss, and there's no justice, there's no equity to it. There's no corrective to that. And it eats itself, it embeds itself into our bodies. Thank you.